The second part of the book is called Logotherapy in a Nutshell, and it was added much later in 1968. It is important to point out, and Frankl even mentions this in the beginning of this part, that this is going to be a very condensed explanation of logotherapy. It originally required 20 volumes in German for Frankl to lay out the concept of logotherapy. So obviously, this being the summary of an already condensed version, don't expect to therapize your friends after this. With that out of the way, let's jump right in. Logotherapy is most commonly compared to a method developed by another one of my fellow Austrians, psychoanalysis by Sigmund Freud. Psychoanalysis seeks to treat mental disorders by looking at the interaction between our conscious and our unconscious. It wants to bring repressed fears and conflicts into the conscious mind with techniques such as dream interpretation. Logotherapy, on the other hand, is less retrospective and less introspective. It rather focuses on the future and where to find meaning in that future. This meaning can help patients overcome their neurosis. Logotherapy is therefore a meaning-centered psychotherapy. Logos, by the way, is Greek and describes meaning, so I guess that explains the name. Additionally, it focuses on breaking up vicious cycles of neurosis or mild mental illnesses that cause stress. In contrast to the first Viennese school of psychotherapy by Freud, which advocated for the pleasure principle or will to pleasure, or to the second Viennese school by Adler, which advocated for the will to power, the third Viennese school of psychotherapy by Frankl says that our search for meaning is the primary motivation in our life.
You scarcely will find any reference to what is the most fundamental and basic concern of man. Neither pleasure nor happiness, nor power or prestige, but originally and basically his wish, his desire to find and fulfill a meaning in his life, or for that matter, in each single life situation confronting him.
This meaning is unique and specific in that it must and can be fulfilled by oneself alone. Only then does it achieve a significance which will satisfy our own will to meaning. A poll done in France showed that 89% of the people said that one needs something to live for. 61% of those people even said that there was something or someone in their own lives for whose sake they were even ready to die. In another survey conducted with over 7,000 students at 48 different universities, students were asked what they considered very important to them. 16% of the students checked making a lot of money, and 78% said their first goal was finding a purpose and meaning to their lives. It seems almost redundant to talk about these surveys. To satisfy our will to meaning is our main drive. That makes sense intuitively. It is reflected not only in this data, but also in my personal experiences. Watch out, anecdotal evidence coming up.
Yeah. Not.
Science!
Almost everyone I know is looking for that purpose somewhere, even if they may not describe it as such. Be it in their family, their profession, or some other occupation which they deem important. Sometimes we struggle to find that meaning, and if we don't, we become miserable. Which brings me to the next concept Frankl introduces. Existential frustration, the suffering of a meaningless life. Existential frustration can cause neurosis, and this type of neurosis is called neurogenic neurosis. Neurogenic neurosis does not come from conflicts between drives and instincts, but rather from existential problems. Therefore, the adequate therapy for these cases isn't psychotherapy. Frankl gives us an example here, which I'm just going to read to you since I can't really shorten it without taking away from the story, and he put it better than I ever could anyways. A higher-ranking American diplomat came to my office in Vienna in order to continue psychoanalytic treatment, which he had begun 5 years previously with an analyst in New York. At the outset, I asked him why he thought he should be analyzed, why his analysis had been started in the first place. It turned out that the patient was discontented with his career and found it most difficult to comply with American foreign policy. His analyst, however, had told him again and again that he should try to reconcile himself with his father, because the government of the US as well as his superiors were nothing but father images. And consequently, his dissatisfaction with his job was due to the hatred he unconsciously harbored toward his father. Through an analysis lasting 5 years, the patient had been prompted more and more to accept his analyst's interpretations, until he finally was unable to see the forest of reality for the trees of symbols and images. After a few interviews, it was clear that his will to meaning was frustrated by his vocation. He actually longed to be engaged in some other kind of work. As there was no reason for not giving up his profession and embarking on a different one, he did so, and with most gratifying results. He has remained contented in this new occupation for over 5 years, as he recently reported. I doubt that in this case I was dealing with a neurotic condition at all. And that's why I thought that he did not need any psychotherapy, nor even logotherapy, for the simple reason that he was not actually a patient. Frankl maintains that not every conflict is necessarily neurotic. Some amount of conflict is normal and healthy. Just like suffering is not always a symptom of neurosis, suffering may well be a human achievement, especially if the suffering grows out of an existential frustration. In other words, it is part of our search for meaning. A man's concern, even his despair over the worthwhileness of his life, is an existential distress, but by no means a mental disease. A doctor should in this case not bury his or her patient's existential distress under tranquilizing drugs, but help the patient through his or her existential crisis of growth and development. In logotherapy, this means helping the patient find meaning in his or her life, which is an analytical process. It tries to make the patient aware of what he or she actually longs for deep inside. Logotherapy considers a person a being whose main concern is fulfilling a meaning rather than a mere gratification or satisfaction of instincts. The search for this meaning may cause inner tension, but precisely this inner tension is important to mental health. If architects want to strengthen an arc, they increase the load that arc has to support, because that just makes the parts join more firmly together. So maybe therapists shouldn't be afraid to create some amount of tension if it is directed towards finding meaning in one's life. As Nietzsche said, he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. Frankl references the earlier parts of the book here, saying that in the concentration camps, those who knew that there was a task waiting for them to fulfill were most able to survive. He himself had a manuscript confiscated upon being taken to Auschwitz, and the desire to rewrite it helped him going. When in a camp in Bavaria, I fell ill with typhus fever. I jotted down on little scraps of paper many notes intended to enable me to rewrite the manuscript, should I live to the day of liberation. I am sure that this reconstruction of my lost manuscript in the dark barracks of a Bavarian concentration camp assisted me in overcoming the danger of cardiovascular collapse. Frankl now turns his attention away from his own past and to the meaninglessness that haunts so many people today. He calls it the existential vacuum, which has its roots in two factors. Firstly, gaining consciousness forced us to make choices, because we could no longer rely on our animal instincts for what to do. And secondly, traditions that guided our behavior for the majority of human existence are rapidly disappearing. Note that this isn't a judgment call or an old man yelling at clouds, it's merely an observation. Sometimes we don't even know what we want, in which case we can either do what other people do or do what other people tell us to do.
Now, neither knowing what he must do nor what he should do, he sometimes seems no longer to know what he basically wishes to do and what is the consequence. Either he just wishes to do what other people are doing, this is conformism, or else he just does what other people wish him to do, and this is totalitarianism. Now, this is the origin of the existential vacuum.
This existential vacuum is quite common. According to his surveys, 25% of Frankl's European students and an astonishing 60% of his American students showed some degree of existential vacuum. It manifests itself mainly in boredom, and Schopenhauer was right when he said that mankind was apparently doomed to fluctuate eternally between two extremes of distress and boredom. Frankl argues that boredom is now bringing psychiatrists more problems to solve than distress. He then talks about automation leading to even more leisure time being available to workers, which will further worsen the problem. Now, I'm not going to get into the economics of this argument, this isn't that kind of book, but it was sort of funny for me to read this in 2020. And God, I hope somebody will be watching this in 2040, because I'm sure they'll be laughing at me right now with my ridiculous smartphone that doesn't even have beaming capabilities. Frankl calls this kind of depression that afflicts people who become aware of the lack of content in their lives when the rush of the busy week is over and the void within themselves becomes apparent. Sunday neurosis. It is a very common crisis for retirees. People sometimes try to compensate for this frustration with power, or as Frankl puts it, the most primitive form of power, money. Sometimes they may try to compensate for it with pleasure, which is why we can observe that the sexual libido becomes rampant in some cases. By the way, whoever just thought of Freud and Adler? Yes. If this existential vacuum exists in neurotic cases, we're not necessarily dealing with a nogenic neurosis. However, we still have to supplement our treatment with logotherapy, otherwise we will never succeed in filling this vacuum. By filling the existential vacuum, we are preventing the patient from suffering further relapses. Frankl quotes Magda B. Arnold, "Every therapy must in some way, no matter how restricted, also be logotherapy." Now, what do we do if a patient asks us what the meaning of life is? We'll discuss that in the next video. Thank you for listening. To summarize, today we talked about logotherapy being a school of psychotherapy that focuses on the future and on the will to meaning for tackling neurosis. We introduced the concept of existential frustration, which is the suffering of a meaningless life. Some conflict is necessary, and logotherapy aims to help the patient find meaning in his or her life to fulfill this existential vacuum.